Last week, we looked at the historical and literary context of the literatures of Africa, Middle Passage, and slavery. And this week, we're going to look specifically at slavery in the Americas. Early Black advocates of freedom studied the history of bondage as far back as ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. David Walker, who was he was born to a slave father and a free mother and grew up free. Eventually, he settled in Boston. He became an abolitionist and a writer. He found that while slavery had long been practiced in Africa, white Christian slaveholders were guilty of greater crimes against humanity and greater hypocrisy in justifying those crimes than any previous system of slavery. This view of slavery has been supported by 21st century scholarship. In 1501, Spanish ships carrying abducted Africans to the West Indies to be sold inaugurated the transatlantic slave trade. In 1867, the last ship from Africa discharges its human cargo in Cuba. So over this 366 years, approximately 12.5 million human captives were shipped from Africa to Europe and the Americas. 15% of them died along the way. This map shows the slave trade from 1650 to 1860. And you can see that the majority of the slaves ended up in Brazil with 5 million and 4.5 million in the West Indies. And then 500,000 ended up in the United States, the British portion of the United States. And another 3 million, 0.3 million, ended up going to Europe. The slave trade was all about money, as most things in life are. The European colonizers from Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Great Britain, France, Denmark, and Sweden, of course, they went into Africa to take everything they could to plunder Africa of all of its natural resources, and they wanted to maximize their profits from precious metals, sugar, rice, rum, tobacco, cotton, coffee, and indigo, trading them into the Americas. And they found that Africans were the hardiest and cheapest labor force in these high mortality industries. That they found through trial and error, as they had been enslaving the peoples that they had conquered in the Americas and in the West Indies. In 1517, Spanish missionary to Hispaniola, Bartolomé de las Casas, recommended importing Africans to the Spanish colonies to relieve the mistreatment and suffering of the native peoples of New Spain. So they had been treating the native peoples on the island of Hispaniola so poorly that they were decimating the population there, and in order to put an end to that, they decided, well, we'll just bring Africans instead. So by 1820, African slaves made up 80% of all immigrants to the Americas since 1500. 90% of those went to Brazil and the Caribbean, 8% went to North America, and my guess is the other 2% never made it anywhere. It's important to understand, though, that the first Africans in North America were not slaves. The first Africans in North America were explorers. Estebanico, who died in 1539, opened New Mexico, what is now New Mexico and Arizona, to Spanish settlement. Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable, who lived from 1745 to 1818, founded a trading post on Lake Michigan that is now the city of Chicago. They also came into British North America as indentured servants. And it's important to understand that indentured servants were not slaves. They were servants who had the opportunity after a set amount of time and possibly for a certain amount of money to earn or buy their freedom. And they weren't just Africans who were indentured servants. But the first group of indentured servants, African indentured servants, arrived in Jamestown via a Dutch slave ship in 1619. That was a group of 20 that included at least 3 women. As the plantations grew, though, by 1700, the British North America had become more of a plantation economy, and they needed a cheap, easily controlled, and easily replaced workforce. And by instituting the system of chattel slavery, they were able to rise to economic preeminence, to see the rise to economic preeminence of tobacco, cotton, and rice planters of British North America. Chattel slavery was particularly cruel. It consisted of what amounted to social death, in which the captives were stripped of their African religious beliefs, cultural practices, languages, and pretty much anything that tied them to their home and their cultures. The idea was to create what was called a social non-person. This non-person would have no family, no personal honor, no community, no past, and no future. The intention of chattel slavery was to dissolve normal familial and communal ties and replace them with an absolute dependence on and identification with the master's will. Self-reliance, a cardinal tenet of the popular American doctrine of rugged individualism, was forbidden the slave because the very notion of selfhood had no meaning or application to those who could not even possess themselves. So slavery was, of course, closely tied with American racism. Chattel slavery was uniquely powerful and oppressive. It was founded on the belief that enslavement was the natural and proper condition for people of particular races. Those theories were advanced by Western philosophers such as Friedrich Hegel, Immanuel Kant, and David Hume, and they led most Europeans and Americans to believe that external differences in complexion, hair, and physical features signified inherent character differences in intelligence, morality, and spirituality. Another proponent of this idea was one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. He did at one point condemn slavery in his Notes on the State of Virginia in 1787, but at the same time he advocated for a complete separation of blacks and whites, with whites in absolute control, until blacks could be removed from the country, which he saw as the only way to avoid any sort of racial uprising. For Jefferson, darkness of skin signified immovable evil, the absence of light in the black person. It signified this unknowable alien and the threatening other of the black person. A sizable school of racist writers in the first half of the 19th century in the United States followed Jefferson in arguing that the African Americans' physical and cultural differences amounted to an intellectual, spiritual, and moral otherness that only slavery could manage and turn to some productive account. So even though racism was inherent in the whole system of slavery, there was resistance to slavery and to racism. Before we talk about that resistance, though, we have to understand that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution that was created after the U.S. won independence from Britain, it contained several measures that actually protected slavery. One of those, which was mentioned in last week's lesson, was the Three-Fifths Compromise. And in the Three-Fifths Compromise, a slave would represent 3/5 of a person for the purposes of congressional representation. So in the South, which is of course where most of the slaves were, that would mean that Southern states would have more representatives than they would have if the slaves were not counted at all. And since the slaves couldn't vote, this just basically enhanced the size and power of the Southern Bloc in the U.S. House of Representatives, which was overwhelmingly pro-slavery. So anti-slavery groups in Pennsylvania and New York primarily, which were backed by the Quakers, the Society of Friends, issued calls for gradual abolition of slavery, and this was under this idea of moral suasion. So putting it out there as a moral obligation to end slavery. As a result of their work, abolition laws were passed in Vermont, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. So by 1810, slavery was effectively eradicated in the North and the Northwest Territory. In 1807, the U.S. Congress outlawed the African slave trade, or the transatlantic slave trade, but not internal slave trade. So they could no longer bring slaves from outside of the United States, but slavery and slave trade was allowed to exist freely within the United States and its territories. So in the North, where slavery had been abolished, African Americans joined whites working for political and social change. They started their own newspapers, including Freedom's Journal, which we mentioned last class, or last presentation. And in those publications, those newspapers, they published essays, poetry, fiction, and all kinds of other writings that urged achievement of blacks in the North and advocated for ending slavery in the South. They African Americans pushed for admission to public schools. Part of that urging achievement, they wanted access to education, just like any other people. So they pushed for admission to public schools, and they protested against laws keeping them out. The rise of independent Black Methodist and Baptist churches, along with mutual aid, fraternal, and debate societies in cities such as New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia, created this solidarity and progressive outlook of Northern Black communities. And they were working to overcome a lot of the challenges that they had while they were still under slavery, and they were trying to increase their presence in the intellectual sphere, the political spheres, so that they could be more active, more educated, more productive members of society. However, the North was still entrenched in social prejudice, discrimination, and segregation, despite good citizenship and movements toward self-improvement within Black communities. So there was no more slavery, and Blacks had access to education, but there was still segregation. And they were still looked on with discrimination and prejudice by many of their fellow white citizens. In the South, racism was the cornerstone of social, economic, and political order, and African Americans could do little to change their situation, especially slaves, but even free blacks. The living conditions depended on the dispositions of their masters. If they had a good master, perhaps they would have a decent lifestyle. Maybe they would even learn to read and write, do some basic math, and have some form of dignity afforded to them. But if they had a bad master, they were treated like worse than the animals that they were working with. There was some liberalization of laws in the Upper South, as an influence from the North, but the economy grew more and more tied to slavery because the plantations were growing and growing and growing. So there were 700,000 slaves in 1790. By 1830, there were 2 million slaves in the South. In 1831, in Southampton County, Virginia, Nat Turner, a black preacher, led a slave revolt. He believed he was called to usher in the biblical day of judgment, and he gathered up his followers. About 60 to 80 followers went after him, and they headed toward the town of Jerusalem, which was the county seat of Southampton County at that time. Along the way, they executed 60 whites, including Turner's master and his master's family. Turner was captured in late October in 1831, and after he was captured, he hastily dictated the Confession of Nat Turner, which is one of the most widely read slave narratives. And then he was hanged on the 11th of November in 1831. The South didn't react particularly well to this uprising, and it's interesting, it was only 60 to 80 out of 2 million people who participated in this uprising, yet it had a great impact on the South. Lawmakers struggled with whether or not they should ease up on the slaves or tighten down, and they chose to tighten up all of the restrictions. So they got together and they created tighter restrictions on free blacks, on black opportunities to assemble, especially in church, because Turner had been a minister, on black ministers, because Turner had been a minister, and access to books, even the Bible, and literacy, which that one, even though this was a violent and bloody uprising, remember that the slaves were drawing upon their understanding of Christianity to speak against slavery. So taking away their access to the Bible was one way of keeping them from thinking too much about the Christian faith and morality in relation to slavery. Powerful white men defended slavery and worked to see it extended into new territories beyond the Mississippi River. So these tensions between the northern states, which had abolished slavery, and the southern states, which were double down trying to extend slavery, opened some deep divisions between those slave and free state representatives in the U.S. Congress. They enacted a series of compromises in order to try to maintain balance and maintain some semblance of unity in the national government. One of those was the Compromise of 1850. And in the Compromise of 1850, California was admitted to the Union as a free state. Utah was there was a government set up for Utah, and they were given the choice of whether they wanted slaves or not. Slavery was outlawed in Washington, D.C., and the Fugitive Slave Act was revised a bit and renewed. So the Fugitive Slave Act was one of the most divisive parts of this compromise, in that it required the assistance of federal law enforcement in capturing and returning runaway slaves. These acts didn't really do what they were supposed to do. They didn't create any sense of unity or compromise in the government, but they intensified feelings on both sides that the opposition was gaining an unfair share of power. So this kind of sets us up for where we are going when we head into the Civil War itself. But we can see that there were two very distinct views being espoused in the U.S. Congress for its entire history. So this issue of slavery in the Civil War didn't come out of nowhere, and it was very much tied to the prosperity of the promised land of America. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through our readings for this week and prepare for next week.